This week marks the 15th anniversary of the 2003 U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. And it's important that we examine what happened, how it happened, the lies, the crimes, the mass killings, the destruction, all of it. And George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and the neocons all should hold a special place in the Hall of Shame for mass killers, for what they did to Iraq. But they did it with the support of many in Congress, including some of the most prominent and elite Democrats. But I also believe that we need to understand how we got to where we are today in Iraq, because this is a classic case study in U.S. imperial crimes. And that means stepping back and examining a much broader history. It's a 55-year history that is filled with constant interventions and bombings and sanctions and covert CIA activity and regime change. And in this history, a history you never hear discussed on cable news, the main victims are, as they've always been, ordinary Iraqis.
The latest Middle East crisis, perhaps the most menacing of all, has flared up in Iraq, a country that produces over 30 million tons of oil a year. In this picture, King Faisal is at Kirkuk with his uncle, Crown Prince Abdul Ilah.
July 14th, 1958, Baghdad, Iraq. Army Brigadier General al-Karim Qasim leads a military revolt against the British-backed Iraqi monarchy.
Without warning, revolution has swept away the young King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle, Crown Prince Abdul Ilah. Iraq becomes #1 danger spot. Veteran Premier Nouri Es-Said is deposed. He has fled, and the Republican rebels have offered £10,000 for his arrest. The tide of Arab nationalism is again in flood.
Facing almost no resistance, the Iraqi rebels seize key military and government installations in Baghdad and elsewhere in the country, and they declare an end to the era of the Hashemite royals, who ruled Iraq backed by the iron fist of Western colonial powers.
Our revolution is a real reaction against tyranny and corruption. We want to use our wealth to raise the standard of living of the people.
al-Karim Qasim declares Iraq a republic, and he consolidates power through a revolutionary council. Qasim and his allies create a structure for the Iraqi presidency, where power will be shared by representatives of the three largest groups in Iraq, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurds. Qasim becomes prime minister, and the new government begins to implement sweeping economic and political reforms. This new government seized nearly all of the land in Iraq that was controlled by the British-owned Iraq Petroleum Company and redistributed that land to Iraqi farmers. And Qasim pulled out of the U.S. and British-run Baghdad Pact, which was aimed at keeping the Soviets away from Middle Eastern oil.
At Lancaster House, London, representatives of 5 nations meet to discuss a crisis. Mr. Macmillan, who presided, opened the meeting with a tribute to King Faisal.
We meet today under the shadow of the recent tragic events in Iraq.
While the British and Americans began plotting to isolate and possibly remove Qasim, the new revolutionary government in Baghdad gained rapid, widespread support in the country. Laws on women's rights were passed, and amnesty was granted to Kurds who had engaged in uprisings in Iraq in the 1940s. Qasim also ended a ban on the Iraqi Communist Party. He pulled Iraq out of these security and military partnerships with the United States and other Western countries, and he normalized relations with the Soviet Union. Qasim openly backed Palestinian liberation causes and the Algerian resistance against the French. He also stated clearly that oil-rich Kuwait was part of Iraq, and that its independence was a project of Western oil corporations. Qasim nationalized many of Britain's oil fields and formed a new Iraqi national oil company.
The storied capital city of Baghdad is the scene of the latest bloody coup d'etat, a demonstration of violent 20th century Arab tensions set against a way of life that has changed little since the Dark Ages.
The United States and Britain wanted Qasim gone, and the CIA, under John F. Kennedy, began working with Iraqi factions that the U.S. believed could help overthrow Qasim, namely the Ba'ath Party and one of its most vicious henchmen, a man who had actually tried to assassinate Qasem in 1959. His name, Saddam Hussein. And that assassination attempt failed. But a few years later, on February 9th, 1963, al-Karim Qasem was overthrown, and he was executed after a bizarre show trial on Iraqi radio.
The storied city of Baghdad, capital of Iraq, has been the scene once more of bloody revolt that has seated a new government. For 5 years, General Qasim Wright ruled the country by armed might after he seized power by assassinating King Faisal and the Prime Minister. Now, like many before him, he has fallen as he rose violently. A pro-communist, Qasim died before a firing squad in the wreckage of the Defense Ministry building.
As Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party consolidated power, they massacred thousands of people, including a huge number of communists.
Army and militiamen carry on the search for communist infiltrators, over 100,000 of whom entered Baghdad during Qasim's regime. When they are found, the communists from other countries are deported. Native Reds, known for crimes perpetrated on behalf of Qasim, are sent before firing squads. As the Arabs show, they are more concerned about the dangers of communism than is realized by some Western leaders.
The interior minister of the new regime would later say that the Ba'ath Party came to power on a CIA train. Yes, a decade after overthrowing the democratically elected leader Mossadegh in Iran, the CIA played a similar role in toppling the Iraqi government, which, like Mossadegh, was unfriendly to colonial Western oil corporations. The CIA provided lists of people for Saddam and his men to exterminate. Those lists were compiled at CIA stations across the Middle East. Suspected communists, leftists, or supporters of Qasem were tortured and summarily executed.
The streets of ancient Baghdad become the scene of a short but decisive revolution that topples the pro-communist government of Premier al-Karim Qasem, shown here on the right. A 6-man military junta seizes power on a holy day, and within hours the premier, who reportedly had executed 10,000 people, is himself shot.
The U.S. and other Western powers characterized the overthrow of Qasem as a victory against Soviet incursions into the Middle East, and Washington responded enthusiastically to Qasem's downfall. The characterization that it was a massive blow to the Soviet Union became the dominant narrative, and the United States started to resume military aid to the new Ba'athist regime. By the time Saddam Hussein officially took over as the president of Iraq in 1979, the country was considered by the U.S. to be one of its most strategically important regimes in the Middle East, particularly after the U.S.-backed Shah was overthrown in neighboring Iran.
Khomeini, almost unknown outside of Iran just a few months ago, returned a hero, the man who from long distance had led the revolution to topple the Shah. Inside the airport terminal, Khomeini was greeted by scores of Muslim religious leaders and political allies. He called on Iranian Prime Minister Bakhtiar to resign and said all foreigners should leave the country. In an obvious reference to the United States, he said, "Foreign advisors have ruined our culture and have taken our oil."
When the Islamic Revolution of Iran happened in 1979, the Iran-Iraq War soon followed and would kill hundreds of thousands of people, some estimates say as many as 1 million dead. The United States supported both sides in that war, but no doubt wanted Iraq to win. Saddam was known as a brutal mass murderer, but that was preferable to Washington over an Islamic government. U.S. war planners gave Saddam Hussein targets to bomb throughout Iran. They poured weapons into the effort, and the Reagan administration removed Iraq from the list of state sponsors of terrorism so that the weapons could flow unimpeded.
Well, the Ayatollah is in a war. And if he's going to go on with provocative acts against us or anyone else, then he's running a great risk because we're going to respond.
After Reagan removed Iraq from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, the U.S. began increasing its military aid to Iraq, including selling Iraq attack helicopters that were used in the most famous incident of the Iran-Iraq War involving chemical weapons. And that was when Saddam Hussein ordered the gassing of Kurds in Halabja. Donald Rumsfeld, who was a private citizen at the time, was tapped by the Reagan administration as a special envoy, and he traveled to Iraq in 1983 to deliver a gift to Saddam Hussein from Ronald Reagan. It was a pair of golden cowboy spurs.
Tell me what was going on during this
Where did you get this video? From the Iraqi television?
This is from Iraqi television.
When did they give it to you? Recently or back then?
We've dug this out of the CNN library.
I see. Isn't that interesting? There I am.
So what was going on here? What were you thinking at the time?
Well, Iraq was in a war with Iran. And the United States had just had 241 Marines killed. And President Reagan asked me to take a leave of absence from my company.
In that meeting, Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein discussed solidifying U.S.-Iraqi relations. And it was during this period, when the U.S. was at its most cozy with Saddam Hussein, that the Iraqi dictator was at his most brutal. He was a mass murderer, but he was Washington's mass murderer. It was only when Saddam Hussein decided to invade oil-rich Kuwait, a country that many Iraqis characterized as an oil field with a flag, that the U.S. posture changed. Suddenly, overnight, Saddam was being compared to Hitler, and George H.W. Bush launched a massive air attack on Iraq in 1991.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized.
Despite Bush's claim that the U.S.-led attack was aimed at the Iraqi military and Saddam Hussein, the Gulf War saw the United States bomb Iraq back centuries. Its civilian infrastructure was obliterated, its water treatment and sewage facilities destroyed. The U.S. also heavily used depleted uranium munitions that would later cause a skyrocket in cancer and birth defects. But George H.W. Bush decided to keep Saddam Hussein in power. Why? Because he was considered preferable to an Islamic government, particularly one that would have aligned itself with Iran. And so, Saddam remained.
As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Under Bill Clinton, the U.S. imposed the most sweeping economic sanctions in modern history. It was tantamount to economic warfare, not on Saddam or his government or his henchmen, but on the Iraqi people. When the United Nations estimated that upwards of 500,000 Iraqis were killed as a result of the sanctions, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, defended it on 60 Minutes.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
In addition to the sanctions that Madeleine Albright was defending, Clinton initiated the longest sustained U.S. bombing campaign since Vietnam, at some points bombing Iraq an average of once every 3 days throughout the 1990s.
My fellow Americans, this evening I want to speak with you about an attack by the government of Iraq against the United States and the actions we have just taken to respond. This past April, the Kuwaiti government uncovered what they suspected was a car-bombing plot to assassinate former President George Bush while he was visiting Kuwait City. The Kuwaiti authorities arrested 16 suspects, including 2 Iraqi nationals.
In response to an alleged plot to kill former President George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton ordered an airstrike in Baghdad that killed several Iraqi civilians, including the famed painter, Layla al-Attar.
Who killed this woman, this artist, this mother? Who broke the candle and snuffed out her light? Along with her husband, and wounded her children, and sauntered away like a beast in the night.